Welcome back, Wizards, to another episode of the Wizard Factory podcast, where you subscribe for weekly videos exploring deeper knowledge of the universe and yourself. My name is Logan Hart.
And I'm Brian Easterday.
And today we are joined by Jennifer Weinstein, who is an energy worker, a shamanic rune worker, a folk herbalist, and a teacher. She is born and raised in France and has been in America for the last 17 years. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for having me, guys.
Our pleasure.
Thank you for being on.
So, friends, today we're going to be discussing the topic of animism, something that we've definitely gotten into a lot here on the show, but maybe not so in depth as we could. So we felt it was time to dedicate a whole episode to this very broad topic and frankly hard to define. So, and typically we start by defining our terms here. So how is it that you define something that is undefinable? And we'll get into more of what I mean by that. But Brian, would you like to start by throwing in your definition?
Sure. How I really see animism is the idea of understanding that everything has a life force or an essence to it, and just learning to see things from a lot more of an interconnected kind of a place, and seeing a purpose and a lesson in every little thing, whether that's looking at a flock of birds that's flying by, or observing a stream as it flows by, or whatever it is. There's all different forms and ways you can practice animism, but it's all about developing that personal relationship with yourself and nature is what it really comes down to.
I fully agree with that. It's a very good way to put that. Jennifer, would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. Well, I went the traditional route for this one. I went back to the definition of the word. This is how I found it on the internet and how I disagreed with it, but I will get to that afterwards. So there are two definitions from animism. The first one is the attribution of a soul to plants, inanimate objects, and natural phenomena. In that one, my issue that there's no notion of sentience or intelligence mentioned here. The second one is the belief in a supernatural power that organizes and animates the material universe. So here they're just boiling animism down to a belief system, and it's basically denying people having an actual experience, living it as a living practice and not just a blind worship, so to speak. So to me, just like for Brian, it's being about deeply connected physically, emotionally, and spiritually to the world, plural, the worlds around you. We constantly are engaged with our surroundings. We get interactions and feedbacks with our surroundings. It's just like having the TV on all the time, but just we are forgotten the way to connect with that. We could be listening, but we just choose not to. But that will explain that probably later. How we can re-engage with that form of communication.
Right. It's that communion with everything around you and that interrelationship, that yira. And to me, what jumps out about the word is, the root anima, which is essentially like spirit. It's the great divine mind of all that is in all things and is there to teach you in this very personal, individual experience of human existence. And so that's really what it boils down to for me is, and what I meant when I said is the undefinable is because just as you are undefinable in your limitless potential and your subjective experience, and ultimately that's what we are, and that's what we're here doing, is having a subjective experience and relating in our own uniquely individual way with the universe, with reality, and getting the lessons that are there, whether you see them or not. The choice is yours, but that's how I would kind of define that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it really kind of comes down to me of looking at, you know, the animist mindset is very much all about sovereignty. And you see that self-responsibility coming because it's about your personal relationship with yourself and the world around you. It's not coming from a book or from a preacher or something somebody else told you. It's something that you've developed on your own path work. And I think that's a very healthy thing and a way to interact and live in the world. You know, it's definitely a good way to keep yourself from getting caught in dogma.
Exactly. There's no rules. That's the great thing. It's personal. Yes. You can have your own way of developing it, and there's no rules. There's no dogma. There's nothing of the like, and there's no wrong way or right way of doing it. Once again.
Yeah. Well, and when we see, you know, if we look at any indigenous culture around the world, they're all originally coming from an animist mindset. This is really the default understanding of how human beings interact with their world, you know, when they're not having all these other programs and you know, traumas being put on them and they're being forced into little boxes. So, you know, that's yeah, like very interesting.
Born an animist, an anarchist, you know, what all those labels, there's kind of the default state, and ironically those are the ones that we're taught to kind of see as very extreme and radical, but those are just what you have in the absence of mind control garbage that's being perpetuated in all forms at all times, and that's, you know, that's why we're getting into this here, because stressing the importance of that, of, well, you can get back to a state of that by deprogramming, purging all of those programs, and basically cleansing your filter is how I would define it, by way of your means of interacting with the world and getting the lessons that you're here to get. So Brian, yesterday you were talking about how animism is greatly to do with also connection to the elements. Would you like to get into that?
Yes. You know, that's kind of one thing that I think it's interesting to note that a lot of people, you know, myself included, I kind of went through this experience. When you're deprogramming yourself from Christianity or the Abrahamic mindset, and you start getting interested in paganism, the first place you start looking at is in the pantheons, looking at the different gods and archetypes, which there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of value and knowledge to be had in those experiences. But another great place to start is just getting familiar with the earth around you, working with the different elements and developing a relationship with, like, a personal relationship with each one of them. You know, getting out into nature. There's, you know, so many different little ways that people don't necessarily think about as being like pagan or animist off the top of their head, and they're things that kind of a lot of people will even naturally do. You know, just a lot of people will go out for a long walk and really enjoy that, and they'll feel that really makes them feel a lot better. That's animism. When you really get down to that, you're having a relationship, you know, with yourself, and on that walk, because you're probably, you know, thinking to yourself, or you might see, you know, a tree that really stands out to you that just, you know, sparks a beautiful thought, or something, you know, something of that nature. So, you know, I think we need to make sure that we, especially, you know, for those who are first coming onto this path work, make sure that you're really expanding the potentials in which you could interact and start developing your own kind of personal path work. You know, don't always just try to look to someone else for information. You know, it's great to do that. It's great to research, but make sure that you're always developing that relationship with the self.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. And I mean, when you work with the pantheon, you might get yourself trapped once again in a system that is restricting you. Traditionally, I think in the northern mind, the land whites, the spirits of the land have a higher, how can I say, people have a stronger relationship to the spirits of the land than they have to the gods, because they are closer, because they can relate to them. I mean, they can talk to the tree, they can feel the rain. I mean, once again, it's connecting with the elements. It's easier to connect with my tree next door than it is to a god that lives somewhere I can't relate to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point too, because that's, you know, again, you can go out and you can go out and you can see, those different nature spirits and connect with them. Like you said, sit with a tree or sit with a stream or whatever it is. And, I mean, that's, I've always had like some of my most beautiful experiences where I like learn the most about myself, just sitting out by myself in nature. It really is the best place to kind of go and think and have those experiences. So that's a really excellent point, that especially in the Northern tradition, people tended to have a lot stronger of a connection with those land spirits, even more so than the gods,
Mm.
And being in nature, you are naturally becoming more receptive. Something gets triggered that you are, I guess it's the calming effect, that you manage to shut yourself from what's going around you. And whether you're dealing with emotional problems or issue, any kind of issue, the fact that you are into that receptive mindset, you are getting information once again, or you are getting solutions to your problems, whether you are requesting them or not, mentally or verbally. Something happens once again because we are constantly connected and receiving information that may or may not be relevant to us at the time, and we process things differently anyway. So, but as you said, the basic thing and the root of all things, all spiritual practices, is going back to nature. That's where we all came from anyway.
Mm-hmm. So, one thing that I'm getting strongly here is this kind of theme of natural law. It is the mechanism of interfacing with the universe. And the more you learn about these laws of nature that are inherent and built in and very discoverable and accessible to anyone, the more empowered you become. So aligning, discovering and then aligning yourself to those laws to become empowered is really at the core and the foundation of the animist mindset. So you're connecting to the elements. What are those? They're inherent forces of nature that are just there. And you're relating to the physical, the emotional, the spiritual worlds, very shamanic, multifaceted, working on all planes. And of course, working on the plane of causality, which is natural law, the karma, if this, then this, of behaviors, outputs, all that sort of thing. So, Brian, what would you say to that regarding working on the different planes, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual worlds?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think first off, it's very interesting to note that it is a very multifaceted approach, and again, so it's very individualistic, which that's a lot different than you see like with one of the Abrahamic approaches that, it's just this certain way, and or else this happens. So it becomes a very complex way of relating with, with yourself and the world around you. But I think you discover a lot more about yourself in that way, because instead of just having this one way of thinking, there's always more to discover. That even though you might be relating to something, on the physical level in a certain way, the way you relate to it, on the spiritual plane or emotionally could be very different. An example would be like where someone has an object or something that they have an emotional connection with, where another person might just see that object, they're just relating to it in a physical manner, but the other person has an emotional connection to that object. So then, it's different for them. It's coming down to a very individualistic practice and what is working for you. So what works for you may not work for someone else, and that's perfectly okay. And that's what I really think is so interesting about the kind of animist and pagan mindset, is that it's a lot more accepting of just people's differences and things like that. That's an inherent part of it. Not everything has to be this one form, this mono. There's a great variety of difference in the belief system, as we've talked about on the channel before. We're in an ecosystem. You want to have a lot of diversity. It's the exact same with your belief systems. you need to have different belief systems and diverse thoughts in order to have a healthy spiritual ecosystem, so to speak. And I think that's a good way to look at that.
Hmm.
Another really, great place to start with, kind of stepping into that animist mindset is just learning to connect with yourself. So paying attention to your different senses. So if you're going out, on a walk, it might just be, stopping to smell flowers or looking at the trees, or, when there's a sunset, stopping to look at that beautiful sunset and take it in and see what you learn from that. That's one of my favorite things to do, to kind of go gain little lessons. I used to have kind of a little daily ritual I did where I would go watch the sunset every single day and kind of see what lessons came up for me just from looking at that. So it's just like I said, really spending that time with yourself and getting back to that. Like, it's great to go, read books and do research and listen to other people, but start at, the foundational level, which is that relationship with yourself, in nature.
Yeah, it's almost like the world is the book. It's all the information is stored within the reality field in the forest. Like, well, that's where your answers are. So instead of burying your nose in a book, actually get out in there. And I love what you said too about essentially you're talking about engaging the senses. Like, even when you sit down for ceremony, you're lighting, incense, you're working with oils, like everything's very visceral. And I think there's something to that about, it's almost like a way of grounding into your body, into this reality, like the, objective reality is your senses are that form of communication with your body and the outer world. So the more that you can light those up, it's sort of like boosting your power there.
Mm-hmm.
I think the senses are the key here.
Mm.
Because there's no dogma, there's no rules, there's no certain way of doing things. And your senses are your sensors, is how you receive and process the information. That's basically what leads you to develop your own personal practice, in my opinion.
Mm. And so what are some other ways that you personally work to engage your senses when you're trying to activate that?
A personal way, well, it's hard for me to explain because I've always been doing it. But I think a lot of people are disconnected from their body. And that should probably start with reconnecting with the self physically. If you're in nature, touching things, smelling things, tasting things, it's not just a way of gathering information, it's also creating a connection with these spirits or beings around you. To the point that wherever you walk, you are already known and acknowledged. You are part of the web of life.
No, I very much can relate to that in the sense of, I spent a lot of time, like spent a couple years, I've talked about that on the show, just kind of backpacking around up in the mountains in Northern Cali and things. And that it very much is something that just getting out there in nature, and it's, it's looking at that tree or going up and touching it, or you see that, that boulder that you just kind of want to climb on and you want to sit there for a while. But you're like you said, I think it's a really good way that you're building that connection, but building a relationship, I think, is another good way to look at it. And it's that relationship, personal relationship with that landscape around you, which is another really beautiful thing that you see in animist traditions, and specifically like kind of in the practices in regards to plant medicine and things. So this is something that you can on there for that. And in their folk traditions, you see those traditions, there's many similarities, but they also vary region to region, depending on like what is actually available in that natural landscape. So working in the practice with the things that are available to you in your natural landscape is a very interesting way of developing a path work for yourself.
Exactly.
So, next on this list of ways that we're trying to define what could characterize, not necessarily define, but characterize the animist mindset is a strong intuition. Again, something that has largely been disconnected from most people, in the same way that they're not connected with their body, they're not connect with their intuition, their gut instinct, all those sort of things, because their left brain is so dominating. It's all about the fight or flight, the stress, the picking apart, which is what intellect literally means, and that intuition in mind becomes a whisper in the corner because it's been just kind of shoved aside and discounted, discredited. But that is such a powerful resource to a spiritual person, to it's a way of communicating to essentially what I feel is your higher self, is one way to look at that, is divine communications of, it could have something to do with what direction to take or the intentions of a certain person that you're encountering. I mean, it could be about anything, but it's like these little priceless, invaluable bits of information that you can tap into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, intuition's such a powerful tool. I think that's why there's a whole rune dedicated to working with that. So I think that's very, very interesting to note. But again, we've talked about in the show before about how just following your intuition and just one simple little decision can really radically alter the course you're on in life. An example that we've pointed out on the show was like when Logan and I first got connected, I had reached out to him and asked if he was interested in getting like an astrological consultation because I had saw a video that he had done, and it just kind of piqued my curiosity as an astrologer. So I wanted to look at his chart, and me deciding to reach out and then him saying like, yeah, I want to do that. That really radically shifted both our trajectory and what we were starting to do and accomplish in life. So it's a very, very powerful tool to tap into, and I think it's like almost like, I guess you could almost look at it like a sixth sense, in the sense that it's definitely a sense that we have, but nobody ever counts it. Like there's the five senses that people generally like will talk about, but then everybody always kind of discounts or forgets to mention intuition, which in a way I think is definitely one of the most powerful senses there are.
Yeah, and when we talk about engaging all the senses, that includes that sixth sense as well.
Nice.
Intuition is part of it. And it's something we're all born with. So it's just been put aside because we've been conditioned since childhood usually to use the left logical mind, and everything that's imaginative, creative, or just doesn't fit into the left brain mindset is being discarded. And that's a shame, but it's still there. It's not because you think left brain that the intuition is completely gone. It just needs to be awakened and re-engaged with. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any like specific practices, Jennifer, that you feel are really useful for maybe tapping into and learning to develop your intuition more?
Well, first, I think you need to have a relationship with yourself. You need to get used to being in a silent place. Shut yourself from the outside influences, the TV, the computer, the phone, which are always overwhelming us with information that prevent us from recentering on ourselves and from being in a place of stillness where we can be receptive to information and to whatever may come up in our mind or through our senses. And I think that's basic practice of any spiritual tradition out there is first recentering on the self, to be receptive and to develop and get reacquainted with that intuition part of the self. Specifically, it's a little hard to pinpoint because everybody is different, but that's where I would start. That's where I would start. Get reacquainted with being alone with the self and with silence. Silence is often being seen as something ominous, Some people are afraid of silence for some reason, maybe because they associate it with death in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where it starts. Um, that's
It's
really,
it's almost like the feminine aspect of time is like there's events that are projecting, and then everything else is time. It's the void. It's just kind of the empty space in between. And
yeah.
so I think on a subconscious level, there's that aspect as well. And of course, if a person is very disconnected from themselves generally, then it's not so much the silence that they're afraid of, but their own thoughts, their own truth that's trying to come out, and they're rejecting that, and they're in denial. So it's very uncomfortable at sometimes, but being disconnected from yourself is what's actually uncomfortable. The reconnecting is sort of that necessary pain through the healing process, because the pain is inevitable either way. But yeah, getting back to yourself is the only way to even get yourself set foot on any kind of path at all. Otherwise, you're just leashed out to living for someone else and what their desires and ways to exploit you.
Mm-hmm.
Own yourself or someone else will. That's just a fact. It's harsh, but it's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that actually kind of leads us into the next point about self mastery, the importance of self mastery on this path as well. So, Jennifer, would you like to unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. We live nowadays in a world in which we have trouble relating to, and surely not the world in which our ancestors grew up. Even our grandparents, for example, just a couple generations ago. And we can be overwhelmed by what's around us, feeling disempowered. But instead of thinking, well, I feel powerless and there's nothing I can do about it, well, it gets back to the self, to starting with the self. And that's the goal of self mastery. I deeply believe that he who is master of himself is master of his own environment. And by a rippling effect, an energetic effect, you can have an effect on the world around you, or at least on the people in your environment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's, I guess, a simpler way to tackle the greater issue of how can I change the world? How can I have a positive impact on the world around me? That's something. Self mastery is something that's very important to me, and something I've been practicing for a while.
Yeah, it is. It is of vital importance for sure. Again, if you're not controlling yourself, then you're basically just at the whims of what other external influences there are, which they're everywhere. We're constantly being bombarded with someone
Exactly.
else's will, someone else who has mastered themselves, and for better or worse, just because they've mastered themselves doesn't mean they have good intentions. It means that they have taken control of the spindle of the web of weird and begun to try to influence outside as well. Um, so of course, yes, that is central.
And if there's only one element that you can control in your life, it's really truly yourself.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then subsequently your actions and what you're created through those actions, whether conscious or unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jennifer, you described something I'd love to ask you about. It's called the wise woman tradition. What is that to you?
Simply put, it is an herbal tradition which has reclaimed its shamanic roots. Um, the term was coined, or at least brought back to awareness by an folk herbalist and green witch named Susan Weed. And though it's called a wise woman tradition, it doesn't just appeal to women, it can appeal to men as well. The principle is that we are once again responsible on health, and often disease is something viewed as something negative, something that should be treated and get rid of as soon as possible. In the wise woman tradition, disease is not an issue. It's not an enemy. You see it as a teacher. It is a sign that something went out of balance on whatever level, and you need to go to the source of it, to track it down to the roots to reestablish the balance. So the wise woman tradition is not so much an herbal tradition about curing disease. It's about mostly preventing and strengthening the body and keeping everything in balance. And it's a mind, body, spirit approach because you're engaging with the plants. Of course, you're ingesting them, but you're also engaging with them emotionally and spiritually. They are your teachers. Usually, you start with one ally. You study for about a year or so under every condition, every season. And of course, just like the plants are subject to the laws of nature, so are we. And we will react differently to that plant and to its influence throughout the cycle of the year.
Well, that sounds all very in alignment with everything that we're talking about here. Meeting things on the plane of causality, getting to the roots of what's creating things. And also what I thought was interesting was what you said about disease is not seen as a bad thing. It's more of a teacher, which really metaphorically you could take that and apply it to anything, even, you know, in context to the New Age movement, you know, negative emotions, you know, all that kind of thing, rather than seeing it as something bad, seeing it as it's literally pointing you to the answer. It's showing you exactly what's wrong and how to fix it. And again, becoming empowered by that mindset.
It is, but you sometimes have to pinpoint, as I said, you have to find the root cause of the problem. And sometimes it's deeply hidden under layers and years of denial or forgetfulness. And that's those neglected aspects of the self that just get out of control. And once again, it can be a very unpleasant experience to deal with things past hurts, past emotional hurts, or things you just would rather forget about, you know. But the body reminds you that it's never gone away, that it's still there, and that it needs to be dealt with.
Well, that's very interesting because we tend to think of trauma as purely psychological, but many people forget that trauma literally is stored in the body. And so I love that the way you worded that, the body reminds you, because they're trying to forget mentally, intellectually, but that's not where it actually is. And of course, yes, when you're trying to pinpoint things, doing it within yourself is going to be the hardest thing, because you have to be able to see clearly to find the problem, but you can't find what you're actually trying to not see or not look for.
One, you know, that's a really good example to bring up of how trauma being stored in the body. I think that's one reason we see back pain being such like a major issue, especially like in the West and in younger generations. Like there's people are experiencing it younger and younger, and I really think that's all goes down to, like I said, this kind of shamanic root cause of emotional and psychological trauma that's not being dealt with properly. So then it's becoming stored in the body. You know, so that's definitely a good point to bring up. And another interesting thing that I find about that tradition is it really does echo kind of what was originally there in indigenous European societies. You know, there were the tradition of the wise women that, you know, they had this knowledge of herbs and healing and things like that, and most of that knowledge was eradicated out by Christianity and the church, very, very specifically on purpose as well. You know, so I think it's really amazing to see people in the modern age getting back to that tradition and redeveloping it, because that's the beautiful thing about the animist path. You know, there's not a book to burn to get rid of like that. It's a personal relationship. That knowledge is always rediscoverable. So even if one person loses it, another person can rediscover it later. You know, so it's ultimately a belief system that you're a way of interacting with the world would be a better way to put it, that's never going to stop or go away, because it's always there. It always was.
Again, it's the default in absence of
Mm-hmm.
other imposed systems.
Mm-hmm.
So another very large overarching concept that you could align or compare with the animist mindset as we're discussing here is the concept of cycles and how we can, again, not only become aware of them, discover them, but then align our daily life in tune with them. Sometimes this happens almost on a automatic level, such as the moon cycles and female menstruation cycles tend to just sync up without even being conscious of that. But we can see this in a lot of other ways. Looking at, say, astrology and planning, not just in the old days when farmers were syncing their growth and planting and harvesting stuff with the seasons and cycles, but even just starting a new project or new things in your relationship starting to sort of come to the surface, and then you look at what's going on astrologically, and it totally just lines up. And again, it's not like you planned that. It's that we're under the influence of these energies at all times. And so again, the only sane thing to do is become more aware of them and therefore more empowered by them.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think it's, that's a very central theme in animist and pagan mindset, is that change and cycles is really the only constant, I guess would be a fun way to put it. The seasons are always going to be changing. Like the moon's always going to be doing, in a different phase than what it was, the day before. So we're going to, I get, when you start to observe that, and you start to kind of allow yourself to naturally get tuned into that. So instead of, necessarily going off of like what our modern calendar would be, you're more paying attention to, when the sun rises and when it goes down, or, whether, summer is almost here or it's fading into fall. That was one thing that I really enjoyed about when I was living up in the redwoods and things in California. I was totally off grid there. So I never really paid attention to the calendar or anything like that. To me, it was more about paying attention to the weather, or, oh, I know, I'm having less daylight, so I need to, check this for my plants, or I need to, do all these little tasks before it starts, the rainy season gets here, or whatever it is. But when you start tuning into those natural cycles, I found personally that, to me, life is, I guess one way to put it is maybe a lot less stressful, even though that may not be the best way to sum it up. Like there's still you're always going to encounter things, but it's not, it feels a lot more open, a lot more free. You see that there's a lot more time to think and observe when you start tuning into these natural cycles, as well as, instead of just, when you can observe them, like Logan said, instead of just kind of having them overwhelm you, you can actually become aware of them and then choose how to interact with them. So, if the season is going to change, if winter's coming up and you need firewood, cutting it ahead of time, because you're aware that change is going to come, that's then going to make, that process of getting through winter a lot easier. And that's a simple example, but that's really what it's coming down to. It's you have that personal relationship, you're observing the cycles and the patterns in nature, and then you're creatively interacting with those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's funny because, in the lifestyle that we are constantly rushing. We always feel that we're running out of time to do things.
Yes.
Find time to do things, or we're running out of time. But once you start slowing down and reconnecting with the seasons, there is a sense of timelessness. There is a sense of, time not being something defined anymore. And you feel that suddenly, you have a whole lot more time than you actually thought you had. That's a funny part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of hitting me how this theme of it's a very feminine quality to all of these things that we're touching on to, you know, tapping into your intuition, even thinking of cycles. Well, the circle represents the female, you know, and the line is the masculine. So thinking of time in a linear fashion, like a tunnel, you need that light at the end of the tunnel, right? And things can seem like hopeless if you can't see the end of it. But when you're looking from that perspective of everything just being cycles and circles, it's like, well, you understand that everything has a beginning and an end. It feels a little bit more encouraging just knowing that you can just sort of ride those waves instead of just trudging down this tunnel one direction and hoping it'll end soon. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, and that was one theme that we kind of like talked about in our previous episodes. We had just done a breakdown on an allegorical breakdown of the dark crystals, you know, and some of the things that we hit on in there, you know, we're talking, you know, they were talking about, you know, the cycles that, you know, everything is always shifting and changing, you know, and changes could be for good, they could be for bad, but, you know, you becoming aware of them allows you to step into a place of power and then help, you know, direct that energy in accordance with your will, you know, rather than just kind of going through life aimlessly and then having it just happen to you. You create what you want instead.
Right. It's sort of the remedy to that stagnation that we talk a lot about with, you know, thinking about monocrops and all that mono stuff, is that very like patriarchal, stagnant, and, you know, that stuff of course has a place, you know, in the balance of things, but you can see how much the feminine energy in general has been so suppressed, and this is just another way of looking at that. And you know, it's just, you can tell that whoever did all the work to suppress and hide this awareness, they understand that this is the key to our power. That's why they've tried to disconnect us from it. So again, rediscovering and tapping back into that is, you know, it should be something that you have an actual care for your own life and for the well-being of all the human family. So yeah, we're looking at cycles here. We've discussed the seasons and astrology, the moon cycles with menstruation. And one thing I would love to touch on, Jennifer, you know a bit about the runic calendar, which Brian and me are less familiar about that. So.
Well, the runic calendar is basically a transposition of the 12 staves of the Elder Futhark into this calendrical year that we know, the 12 years. So to simply put, it's saying that every 2 weeks you enter another runic month. And having taught runic meditations for several years, I started noticing that there were parallels between what's happening what the energy of that runic month particularly is, and what's happening in the ether and the stars. That was quite fascinating.
So where did you discover that idea to rune, you know, to align them?
That was actually a funny coincidence, a synchronicity. I had a French book on the Azetru calendar, and they started mentioning that, and it started. I noticed that it was making sense. For example, if you just want to stick to the equinoxes and the solstices, the rune Dagas, which is a very solar and hopeful rune, corresponds to the summer solstice. The rune Jira corresponds to the winter solstice, and Jira is basically the end of the cycle, the end of the year, preparing for the new year. Yeah, it's just, and I found it on another website, which is called, I think, the Rune site. So that was 2 places that mentioned that runic calendar. It's not a traditional practice. It's not a heathen calendar per se, but it seems to make a lot of sense to me, especially when you, or for anybody else who is into doing a lot of inner work and self-improvement.
Right. Again, shifting your energetic focus for tapping into that cycle. And what is it that I can, you know, it's all about maximizing your gains. I mean, that's pretty much what every energy exchange is, a business transaction, and you're trying to basically maximize the benefit for you. And obviously you want that to be symbiotic, not parasitic, but what's, typically what's good for one is good for all in that way. So very, very interesting that it's not a traditional practice, but isn't that kind of part of being a modern day practitioner of ancient practices, is that if those people, our ancestors, were alive today, they may be doing something similar. It's about adapting. It's about being, on the cutting edge of self-discovery and looking at new systems, like the internet and things were so much more global minded in general. So I think it's actually really cool that we can actually look at different systems and see those parallels, because at the end of the day, truth is universal, and we're discovering it from the one reality field that we all share. So it's always really interesting to see which ways those parallels line up to confirm.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I remember seeing your post, Jennifer, with that runic calendar, and I always did notice that they very much corresponded to what was going on astrologically, which I find very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And as Logan said, that I think that's one of the very special things about the animist and the pagan path is that not only is it individualistic, but it's constantly evolving. And not just on the level of the individual, but within the collective as well. Like our ancient ancestors, if they came across another archetype or another god that they found useful or something, they just simply incorporate them into the pantheon. That's a practice you see, especially like in Eastern traditions, like in the Vedic and Hindu tradition. You definitely can see them. If there's a different archetype or a deity that people start working with, they just get incorporated into that pantheon. So it's a process that it's always developing. So it's very interesting to see that as people are getting back, and it's just as important to look at that ancient knowledge as it is to, like I said, that develop that your own personal relationship and then take that knowledge forward into a new place of understanding.
So for the final section, we kind of laid out the outline here, beginning with defining things and sort of like looking at what animism really is, and then discussed a bit about tapping into cycles. And finally, we're going to look at practices. Again, this is all about hands-on, real world, doing the work. So practices is where it's at. So we're going to get into a little bit of that, starting with Jennifer, you mentioned yesterday one way of sort of getting in state is just simply laying down, obviously in a natural setting, dreaming, visualizing, that sort of thing. Would you like to dig into that a bit?
Yeah, I guess that's a very simple practice that just about anybody can do. Even if you're in an urban environment, everybody has parks around, so it's everybody can really do it. I call it becoming the land, and that's, I guess, the first step to getting reacquainted with the earthly realm and the elements around you. You basically need to lay down on a piece of on the ground, on a natural setting, of course. If you are in an urban environment and there's noise in the background, but first you need to shut yourself from that noise. I know it's not always easy, but you need to get into a meditative state in which you become receptive. So what I suggest is usually stare at the clouds for a while. Watching the clouds passing by is going to basically empty your mind. And focusing on the clouds, you're not focusing on the noise around you. Then, when you are entering that relaxed state, you can close your eyes and start merging, so to speak, with the land. You basically drain all your tensions. You let go of your worries, your tensions. You sink in the dirt. You release everything that may interfere with your receptivity to whatever is being presented to you. Once you become that empty vessel, so to speak, then things can come to you. Any form of information. that goes once again through the six senses. And depending on your connection with certain senses more than others, you will get different types of messages. Um, for some people, it will be something on the emotional level, a feeling, a sensation. Others might get an image or a vision. Um, you can even have something being whispered to your ears potentially. I mean, it really varies from one individual to another.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think that's a very interesting practice, and to kind of, reiterate for people, just the simple practice of like going out in nature, or, like Jennifer mentioned, if you're in a city or urban area, you can go to your local park and just lay down on the ground and then just kind of start, letting your thoughts slip away, and, letting the earth kind of absorb everything that is kind of in your way. And that way you kind of open yourself up to receiving different messages. And as Jennifer mentioned, everybody receives messages in their own way. Again, it's a very, very unique process. Another really simple method, and this is, one of my favorite ones, is just, going out for, like I said, a long walk, like we talked about earlier, or sitting by a stream. Like I really have a thing that if I'm going to a river, if I can find like a really big boulder that's there by the river, I just always have an urge to kind of climb it and just sit on there and watch the water go by for a while. But it's simple little practices like that. It doesn't have to be this extremely complex relationship, or there's not this stigma that, oh, because you haven't read all of these books, you then can't have access to this knowledge or something like that. No, this is something that it's personal, and it's accessible to every single person wherever they are at.
And once again, that's an intuitive practice. It doesn't have to have a form. It doesn't even have to go through verbal communication. It could be just sensory or visual or whatever it is. It even have to be explained to another.
Yep.
Right, and to me, it sort of checks those boxes of what is actual meditation, even though it doesn't sound like the traditional, sit in your cross-legged position and go like this, or whatever. Meditation is any practice that takes it switches off your intellectual brain chatter and opens you up to receive those messages. And it could even be an activity, like for me, cleaning, something simple like doing dishes, or walking is another good one, because it gives your brain just enough to engage it, but not something that's super in depth that you're having to like calculate math problems or whatever. It's that perfect balance, and that really puts you in that flow state and allows you to be in that desired state that allows you to be more creative, less reactive to different stressful situations or negative feelings or whatever have you. Another method that we were discussing is just in general having a relationship with plants. And this can mean learning about the different local flora and fauna and how to use them medicinally. It could even be something as simple as growing your own food, just having that relationship with them. Brian, I know you know a whole lot about growing food. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, I absolutely. I really get a lot of enjoyment from gardening, and from whether it's the process of just planting the seed for the first time, to watching that little plant start to grow and develop and everything, and then eventually then letting it go to seed itself, and then harvesting that seed for the next year of that next generation, observing that entire process, and when we were talking before, Jennifer, you had mentioned that, especially working with plants, that when you're getting familiar with them, the first thing to do is, or one of the steps is to observe that plant for an entire year, to, observe its whole cycle. That way you know all the steps of it, because certain plants, they have different uses at different stages. Different parts of the plants have different uses. The leaves you can use for different things than the roots, and things like that. But again, it's what you're doing. Even when you're doing a simple thing like gardening and growing your own food, you're developing that personal relationship, that knowledge, that, hey, when I do this, and then this happens, or I know, this plant, if it gets really, really hot, I have to give it some extra water because it doesn't do as well in the heat, or, whatever it may be. It's just that personal relationship that you're starting to develop. But, it's definitely something that I get a lot of enjoyment out of myself, for sure.
Sure, and when you get into medicinal plants, you harvest certain parts of the plant at certain times of the year. Just a simple dandelion, you will have the flowers and the leaves in the spring and harvest the roots in the fall. It's not the same type of medicine, even though it's the same plant. And yeah, gardening is an excellent tool to get grounded and to get reacquainted with the natural world. And in the wise woman tradition, as I was mentioning earlier, you develop a whole relationship with your plant ally this way as well, because it will affect you differently at different times of the year. Now, I used to be a gardener in California because you could grow just about anything all year long. Now that I'm in Seattle, I'm more of a forager. Things have changed a little bit. So instead of growing my veggies, I've been terrible at doing that this year. I'm just getting to get more acquainted with trees, which I have plenty around here. And trees are also powerful teachers, multidimensional teachers.
So. Yeah, I think that's very interesting that you mentioned that trees being multi-dimensional teachers, in the sense that, if we look into our Norse mythology, we see, what are the non-worlds hanging on? They're hanging on the Yggdrasil, the giant tree, that connects all the worlds together. So, I definitely don't think that is in there by accident. So there's definitely something to that, for sure.
Exactly.
So we've got obviously runes. We discuss a lot on this channel, is a practice, a way, a medium of communicating with yourself and with reality, setting intentions, getting feedback. And tarot, oracle cards is another very valid way to do this as well. And then, of course, you can get more into the energetic practices, such as yoga, that sort of thing. And Jennifer, you were talking something about Viking yoga yesterday.
Yeah, I guess it's based on what they call Stadagalder, which is an esoteric practice in which you mimic the runes in the postures that you take, to connect, of course, physically, energetically, and spiritually, and get something out of it.
So you're going to sing YMCA and go like this?
Well, I'll leave that up to you. But usually what they say, let's take the rune, for example, Fehu. People are going to mimic the posture and usually stick with the first letter. I go one step further in creating actual sequences that are pretty much like a runic qigong at this point. And I like to break it down energetically in saying what it does, because once again, it has to do with the self-mastery and how it influences the self and changes your attitude and your perception. So
that's super interesting. I'm definitely not familiar with this concept, but definitely sounds like something I'd like to kind of explore a little bit more. Jennifer, I believe you cover that in any of your platforms?
Well, I am in the process of creating what I called initially rune zines, but I think they're going to evolve in getting actual ebooks. I pick one rune in particular, and I work into, I break it down, of course, in the energetics. I break it down in terms of self-mastery. And I take things a little further in terms of path working. I tapped into, once I found a very obscure book in which the author said he had found a code on a rune wall, rune stone in Uppsala in Sweden. And I thought that was quite an intriguing idea. I didn't quite necessarily agree with the way he interpreted his all the runes, but I think there was something to the code, and I started working with the code. The principle is that to master one rune in one world, and actually our own, there needs to be 8 other runes that need to be mastered in the 8 other worlds. And that's how I started working with pathworking, and saying, okay, in order to come full circle and have learned and mastered that rune in Midgard, you need to have, I don't know, Isa in Asgard and learn from it. I don't know, Jira in Vanaheim, and Lagus in Jotunheim. And these words, of course, they can be viewed as purely mythological. They can be viewed as archetypal. I like to see them as 8 aspects of the self. And basically, when you return to Midgard, you have come at the end of your journey, where you can collect all your informations and draw your conclusions and move on. So, that's also
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting practice to be developing. That definitely piques my interest, being a rune practitioner, but also practicing Qigong is been a very effective practice in my own path work. So the idea of kind of creating a European, I guess, Qigong, or a runic Qigong is very, very interesting and intriguing concept to me. So I would definitely like to learn more about that for sure.
well,
Right.
Sure.
So that's animism, guys. That's in a nutshell a pretty good, I think, overview of what it means at its core. It's a very personal, individual means or path of finding your way and achieving what it is that you've come here to do. And there's all sorts of different practices, things you can do to do that. And I mean, that's the beauty of it, is that diversity. There is no right or wrong way regarding that. It's about trying different things, trying what works, maybe even coming up with new paths of your own. And even if no one finds value, if it works for you, then that's ultimately all that counts. And learning the laws of nature, aligning yourself to them, tapping into that power that's available to you. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So that's going to conclude this episode this week, guys. Thanks for tuning in. As always, if you appreciate this content, please give us a like, help us boost us in the algorithm, subscribe. We got weekly videos always coming at you with new mind and soul engaging content. And just to reiterate, if you're looking to dive deeper into the runes yourself, we recently released a rune course, rune divination course, that allows you to not only learn more about them individually, but in divination, doing a full 9-world rune reading. So if that's something that interests you, the link is down below. We're running a special deal for a limited time, so get it while it's hot. And Jennifer, before we conclude, tell the viewers where they can find you.
Well, I'm on Facebook, of course, Asrunae. I am on Instagram. I have also my website, asrunae.com, and hopefully another platform soon as well. But I am mostly sharing knowledge through weekly posts, daily posts, and through written content right now, written material.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what's your plans for 2020? What are you working on?
Well, the rune zines, of course, the rune ebooks, there will be one issue for one specific rune at a time. I noticed as I was writing them that there's a limits to what you can explain through words, and that I may have to actually create videos around that as well. The runic meditations I've also been teaching for years, so I would like to have a little book of runic meditations that you can carry with you around, following once again the runic calendar. That's, I think, a good one. And yeah, I have other projects as well, but that will unfold with time.
Yeah, that sounds great. We'll drop all your links down below if anyone wants to check those out in the description. And so that's all the time we have today, guys. Thanks again for watching. Check out our initiation package at thewizardfactory.com. And until next week with another episode, be empowered, be inspired, and be encouraged.